questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Le Premier ministre a dit que doubler.
The Prime Minister said that doubling our national debt wasn't a problem because interest rates were low. However, his own expenses increased interest rates and inflation. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance was unable to answer the question about how much interest we're paying on the national debt. If a mortgage agent wasn't able to tell you about the cost of a loan, they'd be fired. So why don't we fire the Minister of Finance? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the person who was unable to answer a simple question was the Leader of the Conservatives. My question is, what is his economic plan? Is he going to cut health transfers? The $200 billion that our government is going to invest in healthcare? Maybe. Maybe they'll cut the $30 billion that we will invest in our national daycare system. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Politics. Canadian citizens are devastated by floods, forest fires, massive storms, and deadly heat waves. Symptoms of global ecosystem collapse. Order. Order. And our planet is dying right before our eyes. And instead of living up to our staggering potential as a world leader in green transition, I'm risking here. Do you mind? Your voters.
People to do their job
Instead,
and then proceed.
$30 billion of a pipeline.
Continue. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition from the top, please.
The Prime Minister said there was no problem doubling our national debt because interest rates were low, Mr. Speaker. But
Just, we'll pause a bit. Wait another second here. We'll come back to the questioning. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said no problem with doubling our national debt, adding more debt than all previous Prime Ministers combined because interest rates, he claimed, were low. Well, his same spending has actually increased inflation and interest rates. Yesterday, the Finance Minister was unable to answer how much Canadians are paying for interest on the debt that she has racked up. If a mortgage broker couldn't tell you the interest payment on a loan, he'd be fired. So why is the Finance Minister not fired for her inability to answer that basic question?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's someone who we don't intend to have fired after the 2025 election, and someone who I actually think should keep his job as leader of the Conservative opposition. And I think one of the reasons he is going to keep his job is he can't answer a simple question for Canadians. And that is, what is his positive plan? What does he actually propose to do for the Canadian economy? The only thing that we know is he's going to cut. He's going to cut the $200 billion that we're investing in our healthcare system. He's going to cut the $300 billion we're investing in early learning.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
One thing we're going to cut is the carbon tax. In fact, now, speaking of that tax, we know that the Prime Minister plans to raise it up to 41 cents a litre, or $1,500 net after rebates per family. But what most people don't know is that there is a second carbon tax he plans to stack on top of the first one, a sneaky tax he calls a fuel standard that will hit home heating, gas, our factories, and countless other higher costs. So how much will Canadians pay in higher gas and diesel prices because of the second Liberal carbon tax?
The Honorable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am glad to hear the Conservative leader actually talking about climate, because the reality is the biggest challenge our planet faces and the biggest challenge our economy faces is building a clean economy. That is where the jobs are. That is where the jobs will be. We've invested $120 billion in our green industrial plan. It is creating jobs today. It will create jobs in the future. The Conservatives would wreck all of that.
Hear, hear.
The Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Now, the question was about carbon tax 2. We already know about carbon tax 1. The Prime Minister has put in place a 14-cent a litre tax that will rise to 41 cents a litre. This raises gas, heat, and grocery bills. But now they're sneaking in a second carbon tax called the fuel standard. It has no rebate whatsoever, but will apply in every province and territory across the country. So if she's so proud of her second tax, why won't she tell us exactly how much it will cost in higher diesel, gas, and household costs per family?
The Honorable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader obviously doesn't understand that what every industrial economy needs is a plan to build the clean economy of the future. But I'll tell you who does understand that. An electrician called Jeff, who I met in Mississauga in March. And I was there to talk with him about the investments we were going to make in electrifying the Canadian economy. He knows that that means for him jobs. He told me I have the skills to pay the bills. And thanks to our plan, those skills will be put to work and Jeffs across the country will pay their bills.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
What she wants is for Jeff to pay her bills with a higher carbon tax. Jeff will have to pay more tax on his vehicle, more tax on his home heating, more tax on the food that the farmers and truckers bring to him, who are taxed by this scheme the Liberals are putting forward. So I've already said the first carbon tax is 41 cents a litre and $1,500 net per family. Now the Liberals promise a second tax. So I'll ask again, how much will carbon tax 2 add in extra diesel, gas, and household costs per family?
The Honorable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I want is for people like Jeff who have the skills, people like Jeff in Mississauga. His wife, by the way, is an emergency room nurse, and our investments in healthcare are helping her pay the bills too. But I want people like them to be able to pay their bills today and tomorrow and 10 years from now. And that means investing in a green industrial plan. Mr. Speaker, our focus is relentlessly on Canadians and jobs, and we've added 900,000 more jobs than we had before the pandemic.
L'honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Président, les citoyens de Kanesatake.
The citizens of Oka and Two Mountains Lake are going through a major ecological crisis. Two Mountains Lake, the ground and the water table are compromised. It's Indigenous land, but the owner is the federal government. My colleague from Mirabel has been sounding the alarm since 2021, and nothing's been done. What is the government doing?
Honorable Vice-Première Ministre.
The Honorable Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you for the question. This is a very serious and difficult issue. As my colleague said yesterday, while answering the same question, My colleague is working very closely with Indigenous leaders. We know that we have to work with Indigenous residents to solve this problem, which is very serious. Thank you.
Honorable député de...
The Honourable Leader for Berry-Chambly. An ecological crisis, Mr. Speaker, is compounded by a security crisis. If the government ignores criminality, threats, and violence, which prevented solutions under the law, they're the only ones who don't know it. More than 2,000 Indigenous people live in fear, as well as non-Indigenous people who live nearby. After years and years of ignoring the situation, when will the government act with all the determination that the situation requires? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Monsieur le Président, je suis complètement d'accord.
Mr. Speaker, I fully agree with the leader of the bloc. This is a serious situation. This is a situation that is difficult in terms of the environment and in terms of security. I want to reassure all Canadians, my colleague, the minister responsible for the file, we are both working very closely with Indigenous groups to resolve the situation. Thank you.
Honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
The Liberal government is acting like the skyrocketing cost of rent isn't a crisis, when it is one of the biggest challenges faced by Canadians right now. An example, in London, Ontario, we have an increase for a two-bedroom apartment of 23%. For a single mom, that means an increase of $394 a month. Over a year, that's almost $5,000. How does the minister think that a single mom will be able to afford that increase of $5,000 a year on her expenses?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is a very important issue. And one way that that single mother will be able to afford the cost of living more easily is through our investments in early learning and childcare. Her fees across Canada have been reduced by 50% this year. So many mums across the country have told me childcare costs are like a second mortgage. We are bringing those costs down. That is real help for real people, and we are glad to be working with provinces and territories to deliver it.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Doesn't address a problem of high rent. We need action clearly on that, and we need it now. C'est aussi clair que l'inflation frappe pas seulement.
Inflation isn't just hitting rents. It's affecting families through the cost of groceries. We saw grocery costs go up in April by 9%. That's a massive increase for families. At the same time, CEOs from large grocery chains are making massive profits as well as massive salaries. When will the government finally decide to fight inflation and tax excessive profits from those businesses? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Monsieur le Président, on est d'accord.
Again, Mr. Speaker, we agree with the leader for the NDP. We must help those who are less well off. We have to do more to make sure that the wealthiest pay their fair share. Our government is doing exactly that. We invested $2 billion into the grocery rebate. That's going to help 11 million Canadians pay for their groceries. We also set up a luxury tax. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The finance minister misled Canadians like Jeff for years. The latest is when she gave false hope, saying she would show fiscal responsibility and balance the budget by 2028. It only took her 144 days after that to do a massive flip-flop and prove that her budget will never be balanced and run massive deficits forever. It's these massive deficits that gave Canadians the highest inflation and bank interest rate hikes seen in a century. Even random Liberals like Mark Carney and John Manley agree with us. When will she stop misleading Canadians, get off of Jeff's back, and stop her inflationary spending?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Jeff is a real real person, and he told me how glad he is our government is investing in a green industrial policy, and how glad his wife Cheryl is that we are investing in supporting our healthcare system. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? We're making those essential investments while maintaining the strongest fiscal position in the G7. Our AAA rating has been reiterated, and we have the lowest deficit in the G7. That is compassion and responsibility at the same time.
The honourable member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Glad she didn't tell Jeff that the solution was to cancel Disney Plus. And because of her high tax and spend government, Canadians like Jeff can't even afford Disney Plus and are skipping meals. She's going to give Canadians like Jeff a higher gas, grocery, and home heating bills with her second carbon tax. Can she tell Jeff how much more it's going to cost him to heat his home and fill his tank?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind our honourable colleagues on the other side of the room that in their platform in 2021, the Conservative Party of Canada campaigned to put in place carbon pricing, and I quote, that would go up to $170 a ton, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what our government is doing, while investing in Canadians, while building the economy of the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, before tabling budget, the finance minister said by exercising fiscal restraint and by not pouring fuel on the inflationary fire, we will ensure we can responsibly invest in Canadians. Except you need to pay attention to what the government does, not what it says. And what the government did was increase spending by $60 billion, $4,300 for every family in Canada. When will the government take its own advice and realize their spending is making life more unaffordable for Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, instead of believing partisan hacks reading their talking points, I think Canadians should listen to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. When the Parliament...
I'm going to interrupt the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. I'm tired of getting too much noise from this side, so I'm going to ask her to start from the top, and I'm going to ask for not to have the heckling happening. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, instead of listening to partisan hacks reciting their canned talking points, I think Canadians tend to trust the Parliamentary Budget Officer. And in testimony before the Finance Committee, the Parliamentary Budget Officer said, and I quote, "When looking at G7 countries, Canada compares very favorably on net debt to GDP." He also said that having spoken...
But it's starting to rattle again. I'm going to have to... I don't want the Honourable Member for Simcoe North to end up at the end, so I'm going to ask everyone to stop. No, you know the process where we take whatever side is causing the problem, we switch with the ones at the end, and then hopefully... I'm talking. Mr. Banff Airdrie, would you... The Honourable Member, did you want to say something to me? No. Now, keep it quiet or else you'll suffer the consequences. Now, the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm glad to share with this House that further in his testimony before the Finance Committee, the Parliamentary Budget Officer described a conversation he had with credit ratings agency Moody's, who said, and I am quoting, that Canada's deficit should make us, quote, quite happy because by European standards, that's very low. Canada's economy is strong. Our fiscal position is strong. No one should believe the Conservatives when they say otherwise.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe North.
Speaker, it takes a hack to know a hack. Last fall, the finance minister said new spending needed to be matched with government savings. She said the government needed to exercise restraint to not pour fuel on the fire. She also said debt to GDP ratio was the red line. That seems all pretty clear to me, except the government didn't take the finance minister's advice. Mr. Speaker, only one thing can be true. Either the finance minister is being overruled by another leadership contestant or the prime minister, or Canadians can't take the promises that she makes seriously. Which one is it?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I wanted to rise guys, because I think it's important to add some context here. We know the party opposite actually was in power for 10 years, and during that period of time, it was a worst growth record we had seen since R.B. Bennett. And you know what is different, Mr. Speaker?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing the answer. I'm having a hard time hearing the answer because of the shouting. I'm going to ask everyone, including the opposition leader, to maybe just keep it down. Maybe lead by example would be a very good thing. The Honourable Government House Leader, please proceed. Not from the top, but please proceed.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what is different. 2.7 million people aren't in poverty today that were in poverty when the Conservatives were in power. 2 million more jobs than since that party was in power. And yes, these times are difficult across the world right now, Mr. Speaker, but we are leading and we will continue to do so.
Honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Mr. Speaker, I find it a shame that the leader for the government in the House is not answering a simple question. Yesterday, it was a simple question presented by my colleague for Simcoe North. Very simple. Everyone who has a debt knows how debt interest works. The Minister of Finance didn't have the answers yesterday. I will give the Deputy Prime Minister a chance to come back to this. How much debt are Canadians going to have to pay every year? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, Conservatives believe that Canadians aren't smart. Canadians know that our economy is strong. And I'll give you another example. The former Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page, said that the 2023 budget had a credible fiscal strategy. We aren't the ones saying so. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Again, the Deputy Prime Minister refuses to answer a simple question that every Canadian with a mortgage has to know. What's the interest on their debt? Now, let's talk about the budget. It included $60 billion in new expenditures. That's the perfect way to create and feed inflation. A few months ago, she said that we shouldn't throw oil on the inflationary fire. Does she still agree with what she said in November? Or, I don't know, what's the answer? The Honourable Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I'm interested by my colleagues' economic arguments. I find it surprising that they're blaming inflation on those who are less well off in Canada. The Canadian government is helping them. But blaming them for the worldwide inflation is rather cruel. What do they want to say to the 400 children in his riding who are receiving dental care benefits? Do they want to take it away? The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Public Safety emitted a new directive to CSIS, a directive important enough that it was made public. The intelligence agency will be required to inform parliamentarians of threats against them to the extent possible. But what does that mean? Was CSIS not required to inform parliamentarians of threats before this? And to the extent possible, what does that mean? At the discretion of CSIS, the minister, my brother-in-law Luc? This creates more worries than reassurance. Can the minister clearly explain this to us? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the honourable member's question because it is important that all MPs are aware of any threats that are made against any of us, because a threat against one is a threat against us all. We know that the honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills was subjected to threats, and he was not aware. That's why the minister did give a directive to CSIS to ensure that all parliamentarians of this House are informed of any threats whatsoever.
L'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
For months, we've been asking for an independent public commission of inquiry. From threats against MPs to funding of the Trudeau Foundation, everything we've heard warrants serious inquiry. The government says it's taking action. What's it doing? With its new guidelines, CSIS will make every effort to the extent possible to ensure in a timely way to perhaps inform, if necessary, parliamentarians of threats. Wow, I'm very reassured. Frankly, does the minister really believe that this directive is going to solve the issue of Chinese interference? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, my colleague knows full well that this directive is part of sustained effort by our government to counter foreign interference. We've publicly said, the Minister for Public Safety said last week and this week, that threats and interference involving parliamentarians are unacceptable. We've taken the steps required to ensure that intelligence officers are going to take this in hand, work with parliamentarians, and resolve the situation as required.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives warned that the costly coalition's carbon tax would make everything more expensive, and today Canadians can't afford the basics and they have to choose between heating, eating and housing. Glenn from Athabasca says his heating bill is double from last year and a quarter of it was carbon tax. The Liberals' April carbon tax hike already added 14 cents a litre to gas and spiked inflation. After 8 years, the truth is these Liberals are out of touch, Canadians are out of money. So why won't the costly coalition axe their carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, we're in mid-May and already we're seeing record forest fires in northern Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in British Columbia. I've talked to people in Calgary who say they can't breathe because of the forest fires in northern Alberta. Our plan to fight climate change is working, Mr. Speaker. We've reduced carbon pollution by 50 million tons. What's the answer of the Conservative Party? Make pollution free again. Make climate change and forest fires worse. That's not how we'll do it on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
For Lakeland.
But of course, the carbon tax hasn't reduced emissions, and 80% of Canadians pay more than they'll ever get back. However, you know, the Liberals did admit that their carbon tax is meant to make driving more expensive. So they plan to triple those costs, and what are they going to do? They're going to kick Canadians while they're down and add a second carbon tax. Together, those taxes will cost struggling Canadians 60 cents a litre more at the pumps. Did this costly coalition partisan hacks even know or care how much more gas, groceries, and home heating is going to cost struggling Canadians under their carbon tax? And do they really think Canadians can afford thousands more?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to read from the Conservative platform of the last election, page 79, a section called Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Will finalize and improve the clean fuel regulations to reduce carbon emissions from every litre of gasoline and other liquid fuels we burn, turning them into true carbon fuel standard. Mr. Speaker, the difference between the Conservative Party and us, they're all talk, we're all about action, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
The Liberal NDP Carbon Tax Coalition is making life unaffordable for Canadians. And what they don't understand is there are very real and very painful consequences when you hike the carbon tax. When the Liberals triple their carbon tax, the price of fuel per litre goes up 41 cents. The cost of food goes up 34%. And the average that a Canadian farm family is going to pay in carbon taxes is $150,000 a year. Sounds kind of bad, right? But wait, you ain't seen nothing yet. The Prime Minister is going to add a second carbon tax on Canadians, this time with no rebate. How much is this new carbon tax scam going to cost Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the member for Foothills surely knows, Albertans are getting back more than $1,000. That goes directly to the pockets of Alberta families. And you know what else, Mr. Speaker? I was in Edmonton and Calgary recently, and I met a great young woman. Her name is Kyla. She teaches people how to weld. And she said to me that we need a plan, an economic plan for the green economy. She understands that's where her job is going to be. That's where the job of the apprentices she's training is going to be. Albertans get that, Mr. Speaker. It's only the Conservatives who don't.
Honourable Member for Foothills.
The NDP Liberal Carbon Tax Coalition is forcing Canadians to make a choice. Either food on the table or a roof over my heads. The carbon tax punishes families, It punishes farmers. It punishes small businesses who are all struggling to make ends meet. And for what? They haven't met a single emissions target that the Liberals have set. Instead of admitting that their carbon tax scam is a failure, they are doubling down with a second carbon tax, this time with no rebates. How much is gas and groceries going to cost Canadian families when they implement their new carbon tax scam? How much?
L'honorable ministre de l'Agriculture.
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell you that the first people impacted by climate change are our farmers. They are highly committed to fighting climate change, reducing emissions. Our program to help them adopt best practices and acquire new technologies and the innovation program are, as we say, something we all want to subscribe to. It demonstrates their interest and will continue to work hard to reduce our emissions and fight climate change.
Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the federal watchdog for housing rights has called to investigate this government's failure to prevent and eliminate homelessness among women and gender diverse people across Canada, especially at risk Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. And instead of addressing it, the Liberals refused to reverse their cut of $150 million to women's shelters, while barely releasing any funds they first announced in 2020 for shelters and transitional housing. When will this government stop with the empty promises and deal with this housing crisis with the urgency it requires?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I disagree with the Honourable Member. We've gone from just over $2 billion in funding for Reaching Home, Canada's homelessness strategy, to almost $4 billion. That's a doubling of the funding, going to over 5,000 different projects and helping tens of thousands of Canadians to be diverted away from homelessness to permanent housing solutions as well as transitional homes. We've also introduced a rapid housing initiative that is having tremendous success on the ground, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, WestJet pilots could be on strike as soon as this Friday if they don't reach a deal with the airline. They're seeking fair pay, better conditions, and more job security. And in 2012, when Air Canada pilots voted to strike, the Conservative government of the day was quick to force them back to work. My question for the minister, will he stand today and commit to respecting the collective bargaining rights of these pilots, or does he intend to follow the example set by the Conservatives?
Here, here, here. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, right now the Minister of Labour is on the ground in Toronto to make sure that the parties reach a fair agreement, one that works for everyone. Our federal mediators are very good at what they do. Last year, they resolved 93% of federal disputes without any work stoppages. We're focused on the bargaining table because that, Speaker, is where the best deals are always reached. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Speaker, the rising cost of food affects Canadians, small businesses, and families who are trying to put a nutritious meal on the table in my riding and across the country. Last week, with the passage of C-46, came the creation of the new one-time grocery rebate that will deliver targeted inflation relief for over 11 million low and moderate income Canadians and families who need it most. Can the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance tell this House when Canadians can expect this timely grocery rebate?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
I am delighted to do so, and I'd like to start by thanking the honourable member from Guelph for his question and for his advocacy on behalf of his constituents and all Canadians. The one-time grocery rebate will deliver targeted inflation relief to 11 million low and medium income Canadians and families who need it most. That's going to be up to an extra $467 for eligible couples with 2 children, and people will get that support on July 5th of this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Mr. Speaker, it's been a good start to seeding for the farmers in southwest Saskatchewan. And what do they get as a thank you from the Prime Minister this year for being the most sustainable and innovative farmers in the world? Carbon tax 2.0. The Liberals are bringing in fuel regulations that are going to gouge producers and consumers above and beyond the first carbon tax, which they're still going to triple. Now, we already know that the first carbon tax has caused the price of food to go up. So how much more are Canadians going to have to pay after the Prime Minister puts in the second carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we've cleared out the fact that the Conservative Party of Canada had committed to put in place a low-carbon fuel standard during the last election campaign. But let's talk about what the farmers are saying. The Dairy Farmers of Canada has committed the dairy farm sector to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, Mr. Speaker. The Egg Farmers of Canada have announced a commitment to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, Mr. Speaker. So the farming sector knows very well how climate change is impacting them. It seems that the only one who don't know about this is the Conservative Party of Canada.
Dufferin Caledon.
It's incredible. He actually doesn't know how food ends up on his plate. The farmer pays a carbon tax. The truck that picks up the farmer's food pays a carbon tax to take to the processor. The processor pays a carbon tax. The truck that picks it up from the processor to take it to the grocery store pays a carbon tax. The grocery store pays a carbon tax. And then Canadians can't pay for food. When will this partisan hack Finance Minister finally understand that carbon tax causes inflation?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take the opportunity, if I may, just to answer this question by giving the members an update on the situation that's going on across Western Canada. There are currently 209 wildfires burning in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, 75 of which are out of control. Mostly hot, dry, and windy conditions in the next week will continue to exacerbate for those communities. Mr. Speaker, there are close to 30,000...
Let me interrupt for a second. It's just getting rowdy and noisy again. I just have the impression I'm at a frat house party or something. Please, keep it down on both sides. Please. Okay, I'm getting tired of this one. Enough. The Honourable Minister from the top, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take the opportunity to speak about the situation that Canadians are facing, particularly across Western Canada, where there are 209 wildfires burning, 75 of which are burning out of control. Unfortunately, mostly hot, dry, windy conditions over the next week will exacerbate the situation, and shifting winds have pushed smoke across the country, impacting a number of urban communities, Calgary and Winnipeg in particular. Mr. Speaker, close to 30,000 Canadians have been evacuated from their communities, and the Government of Canada is there for those Canadians. We've deployed Canadian Armed Forces resources, the Canadian Red Cross, additional police resources, and together we will be there for the people of Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan through this very difficult time.
Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, it's incredibly disappointing to see the minister politicizing these disasters for his own gain. The fact of the matter is, after 8 years of this Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are struggling like never before as the cost of government is driving up the cost of living, and people are struggling to afford gas, groceries, and home heating. Now they're planning a 41-cent a litre tax on gas, as well as a second carbon tax, which people in Northern Ontario cannot afford, Mr. Speaker, though they have little choice but to pay. So when will this Finance Minister finally scrap the failed carbon tax scam?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what is unfortunate is that the Conservative Party fails to see a link between climate change and the impact in the economy, that they fail to see extreme weather events as being an existential threat to this planet, that they think that they can bury their head in the sand and forget that climate change exists and think that there will be an economy for anybody. Mr. Speaker, if we want to have a planet, we must take action on climate, and we are doing that while making sure that life is more affordable for Canadians, and we will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Battleford's Lloydminster.
Mr. Speaker, these Liberals have missed every single environmental target that they have created, let alone these Liberals have increased the carbon tax. We know there's carbon tax 2.0. How high does the carbon tax have to go so that this government can stop blaming they want to triple the carbon tax to prevent forest fires and hurricanes? How much does this carbon tax 2.0 have to go up?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We know the first people who have to pay for climate change is farmers when they have to deal with droughts like they did in the West and flooding 2 years ago in BC, a hurricane like there was in the Atlantic a little over a year ago. Mr. Speaker, they're the first ones affected, and that's why we have a program to manage risks. We have programs for the environment to help farms be more resilient. The Honourable Member for Rimouski, Neigette, Témiscouata, Les Basques. Mr. Speaker, for the past 20 years, Canada has been sinking into mediocrity in research and science. Canada is the only G7 country to have lost researchers since 2016, the only country to have reduced its investment in R&D over the past 20 years, and it still hasn't indexed graduate scholarships since 2003. While the minimum wage has doubled, graduate student income hasn't gone up a penny. What kind of message does that send to the next generation? Mr. Speaker, all students and student associations are watching us right now. When is this government going to wake up and raise graduate student scholarships? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Been steadfast in its support of science, scientists, and scientific research in Canada. That's why Budget 22 proposed $38.3 million over 4 years for the federal granting councils to add new and internationally recruited Canada Excellence Research Chairs in the fields of science and technology and engineering and mathematics. We'll continue to support a robust science and research ecosystem that reflects Canada's strengths and that advances Canadian interests.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Mr. Speaker, when you regularly attend the court of King Charles III, you can sometimes feel underdressed. That's surely why our last two governors general have cost taxpayers, hold on to your hat, nearly $100,000 in clothing since 2017. $100,000 worth of clothes and shoes. Could be worse. There's a clothing allowance of $130,000 per term. Mr. Speaker, Governors General can dress however they want, but with what they're paid, shouldn't they be able to afford their own clothes? The Honourable Minister of Heritage. Mr. Speaker, many Canadians are having trouble making ends meet these days, and people expect us to manage public monies. Obviously, that includes members, senators, and the Governor General. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks nonsense about improving public safety. First, he passed Bill C-75, which makes it easier for violent criminals to get bail. Second, he passed C-5 to scrap mandatory prison sentences for serious crimes. And his bail reform bill tabled yesterday is so weak that even the accused murderer of police officer Greg Pierce-Shala would have been released on bail. Will the Prime Minister repeal Bill C-75? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to have tabled legislation yesterday to strengthen our bail system. And the purpose of that legislation is to crack down on violent repeat offenders and gun crime. That's precisely what the province has asked for, and that's precisely what the Association of Police Officers has asked for. Police associations all across Canada supported our efforts yesterday publicly, and the provinces will do the same.
The Honourable Member for Fundy Royal.
Only bail reform in Bill C-48 is in its name. Violent repeat offenders can still count on this Liberal government for their catch-and-release system to get them back out on the street, sometimes within hours of their arrest. This bill does not substantially improve public safety. In fact, the man who killed Constable Pierce-Shala would still have been out on release even if this legislation had been in place. When will the Liberals finally do what they've been asked and end catch-and-release?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to quote the Canadian Police Association. We appreciate the ministers have worked collaboratively with stakeholders and introduced this common sense legislation that responds to the concerns that our members had raised. Mr. Speaker, police, provinces, and territories, we seem to agree about the common sense nature of our approach, Mr. Speaker. We have the support of police associations. We have the support of provinces. This will go a long way towards making our bail system not only stronger, but fairer.
Excellent. The honourable member for Fundy Royal.
Doing the bare minimum, tokenism, is not enough. It's not enough in light of the challenges that our police face. It's not enough when 13 premiers unanimously called for fundamental change to Canada's broken bail system. Under this legislation, repeat violent criminals charged with weapons trafficking, attempted murder, robbery, they're all still eligible, Mr. Speaker, for bail. Bail under this Liberal catch and release program. When will this government do what has been asked of them, protect Canadians, make our streets safer, and end catch and release?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this bill did exactly what the premiers asked for in their letter to the Prime Minister and more. We went further by working, Mr. Speaker, with the provincial justice ministers and ministers of public safety. Mr. Speaker, here's what the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police have said. We are convinced that the legislative changes put forth in Bill C-48 will go a long way to help eliminate the preventable harm and senseless tragedies attributable to violent and repeat offenders across Canada.
The honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents are concerned about armed or gun crime. There are too many violent crimes involving weapons and making constituents feel less safe. I know that they, like the Minister of Heritage, they share this concern. What is the message the Government of Canada has for Canadians in the face of this situation? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for her question and her hard work in her constituency. People in my riding, like those of Châteauguay-Lacolle, are affected by gun violence, and I'm proud to say that we've taken action with C-21. It's no secret we would have liked to go even further, but it may not be perfect, but it's something that will help communities feel much safer. And what is clear is that the only way to keep assault-style weapons out of our communities is by electing a Liberal government, period.
On the same day we learned that the price of the average home in Canada shot up again, the Minister of Housing would not answer simple questions about the housing crisis. We asked why rent has doubled over the last 8 years. We asked why home prices have doubled over the last 8 years. We asked him why his own officials have said that we can see a 32% decline in housing starts this year. He told us we were playing games. How can a minister stand in this House continually in the midst of a housing crisis and continue to tell Canadians they've never had it so good?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
It's really hard to take the party opposite seriously on housing. In their previous election platform, they didn't even have the word affordable housing in their platform. Now they released a so-called plan that doesn't have the words homelessness. There's no plan for women's housing. There's no plan for northern housing. There's no plan for rapid housing. There's no plan for co-op housing. There's no plan for helping first-time homebuyers. There's no plan for helping renters. There's no plan for seniors housing. There's no plan for accessible housing. There is absolutely no plan on that side of the House.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. With this Prime Minister, everything costs more, and now inflation is back with a vengeance, a 9.1% increase in food prices over last year. The Bank of Canada could even raise interest rates again. Nothing to reassure Canadians. But this Prime Minister is doubling down. He wants to go ahead with other inflationary policies like his carbon tax. When will he drop his disastrous plan for Canadians? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've already said a number of times here, Quebec has its own system for pricing pollution, which is different from Canada's. It's a cap-and-trade system. And I'd be happy to explain to my Quebec colleague how that system works. Thank you. The honourable member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, this government is driving up the cost of food production by making farmers pay the carbon tax and a 35% tariff on fertilizers. Our family farms are at the end of their rope. The minister keeps telling farmers to go deeper into debt and says the carbon tax doesn't affect Quebec. I can show the minister invoices that clearly demonstrate the opposite. Not to mention the cost of transporting products between provinces. The government needs to understand the damage they're doing to Canadian farmers and families. When will they finally remove the carbon tax on farmers? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, as my colleague, the Environment Minister, just said, Quebec has its own system, and the price on pollution, the federal price, does not apply in Quebec. Unlike the Conservatives, when they were in office, who cut programs for research and innovation, we are investing in our farmers so that they can adopt better practices, have access to new technologies, and we have increased funding for the Sustainable Agriculture Partnership by 25%. Thank you.
Canadians across the country deserve to feel safe from gun violence and crime. In my riding in Mississauga Lakeshore, I've heard from constituents who do worry about the safety of their loved ones. They worry about gang violence, carjackings, and organized crime. Mr. Speaker, can the minister please update this House on the action this government is taking to make our neighborhoods safer for everyone?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague from Mississauga Lakeshore for his hard work. Mr. Speaker, we have promised Canadians we'd crack down on gun violence. Assault-style firearms, Mr. Speaker, have no place in our communities. That's why we're pushing forward with smart policy to get these weapons off our streets, investing in our borders to stop illegal smuggling, investing nearly $400 million to support law enforcement and address guns and gangs. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I introduced a bill that would make it harder to get bail after committing a crime involving a firearm. What do the Conservatives do, Mr. Speaker? They vote against these measures and they filibuster. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker. They have a record of slashing police budgets and stalling.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Today is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, a day we commit to fighting discrimination in all its forms. Sadly, queer communities across Turtle Island and the world are increasingly under threat. Mr. Speaker, lives are at stake here. The Act for Queer Safety campaign and others have put forward concrete proposals for more funding to combat hate. Additionally, the Dignity Network has long called for a special rapporteur to ensure that the protection of 2S LGBTQ rights at home and abroad are protected. When will the government go beyond words, start acting, and implement the calls to action?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, every Canadian deserves to feel safe and supported no matter where they are or who they love. Homophobia, transphobia, transmisogyny, and biphobia, all forms of violence and racism have no place in Canada or in the world. We know that a disproportionate amount of hate is directed at 2S LGBTQI+ communities, and that's why 75% of the 2S LGBTQI+ action plan investments go directly to the critical lifelines supporting these communities. Our government will continue to support them and reaffirm their right to be true. And
the Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, the Public Safety Minister has reached the startling conclusion that there may be, quote, more Chinese police stations operating in Canada, end quote. Not that he would inform the House, having decided to share this stunning revelation of the obvious with CTV last weekend. Mr. Speaker, does the government have a particular number of stations in mind before it takes the matter seriously? How much longer does the RCMP now need to complete an investigation into what is already known? In case they miss it on TV, do they even know about the other stations? Mr. Speaker, is there a threshold for the number of Chinese Canadians that must be intimidated before the government acts?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
All
threats from Russia, China, other foreign actors very seriously. As the honourable member knows, the investigation of these Chinese police stations is being conducted by the RCMP, and the RCMP will continue to conduct investigations as information comes forward. Canadians can be assured that not only are we taking this seriously, but that they are safe here in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today.